So last week I put up a short, silly little video kind of poking fun at the fact that Unity did not have a whole lot of meaningful dots and ECS announcements during their Unite keynote on November 19th. And today I would just like to maybe take a little bit more serious approach to this topic because since then, actually shortly after I put the video up, Unity released their roadmap talk, which details the future of their engine. I'm going to be focusing on the dots and ECS specific things in there because there were a lot of really cool things in that roadmap talk that kind of wish were in the keynote. But there also are a few things that are really concerning that I also wanted to talk about in this as well. Now, before we get any further, I do think that it's important for me to say that I'm going to be presenting some facts and opinions here, and I think you should take my opinions with a massive grain of salt because today's video is actually sponsored by the Unity Asset Store to promote their Black Friday sale. By the way, if you want to learn about dots, I have a really cool asset called Dot Survivors available on the Unity Asset Store, which is also part of that sale. But I would like this video to kind of prompt a discussion about how everyone feels about dots and ECS right now. Do you use it? Are you going to continue to use it? Let's say if you had a friend who is maybe interested in some of the tech that Dots offers, would you recommend them using Dots or just avoiding it altogether? So, just feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below or join us over on the Turbo Makes Games Discord where we can talk about it a little bit more in depth. So I'd like to kick things off just by talking about, how we got to this point because Dots has been in development for quite a while now. And so it's important to, kind of take all this within the context of the entire development history of Dots. So I'm pretty certain that the first ever mention of any dots or adjacent things like that was with the Nordeus demo that was revealed at Unite Austin in 2017, where they had this massive battle where they had thousands and thousands of enemies kind of clashing and fighting against each other. And this was mostly to showcase what the job system and burst compiler could do, and they may have been using some entities things in there. And so if you figure that Unity Dots was in development prior to this Nordeus demo being revealed, and we're coming up on 2026 right now, it's been about a decade of development of Dots. And especially if we'll be talking about some of the future later on that we may not see some of these things be integrated into the core engine until 2027 timeframe. So that is about a decade of development time. Now, good things can take a long time, that's for sure, and I'm sure many people who are in the games industry are very familiar with that fact. But just kind of thinking of things from like a high level Unity business perspective, if they've been working on this for 10 years now and hiring teams of growing and shrinking sizes from all around the world, you figure they've spent probably tens of millions of dollars at this point into this whole Dots initiative, and you think they would really want to see a major return on their investment. So just kind of thinking of it from that perspective, it seems like they would like to, work towards getting these features available towards the widest audience that will kind of benefit the greatest amount of people. But, over this 10-year or so period, Dots has gone through many different iterations. It was kind of kicked off by Mike Acton, where things were very manual and some of these types were even more verbose than they were before, and it was going through a bunch of changes fairly rapidly, kind of up until the version 0.17 version, which is kind of around the time where I started getting involved in it a little bit, and then it was pretty stagnant for a little while, maybe over a year or so from 0.17 until they kind of rebooted in this 0.50 release where they started integrating, more of these cool things like source code generation and, just really kind of preparing for some of these big changes that were finally revealed in the full 1.0 version. And since the 1.0 version, it's, came out a few years ago at this point now, and there has been a pretty, consistent flow of updates coming through. They've been, continually adding to these packages and everything. And, I've been pretty happy with a lot of the stuff, a lot of the changes that they've been making over the recent years here. So that kind of brings me to, the lay of the land of how things are right now before we kind of talk into the future. And, my kind of perspective right now is that, things are overall pretty good, But there are some key areas that are still lacking after, all these years. Of course, the big one is animations and UI and just kind of, integrating with some of the regular Unity features that are, pretty cool to use. There are, certainly some pain points with doing that, and, just kind of working in the editor can still be a little bit frustrating sometimes. It definitely is getting better. They are making their improvements and everything. But, it does feel like a solid product. It doesn't really feel like, hacked together and, very experimental or anything like that. In fact, I was able to ship a game on Steam using dots and ECS called Dot Survivors, which again, I made into a whole learning resource available on the Unity Asset Store. 50% off right now. But I'm not alone. In fact, there's been nearly 700 games made with the Entities package shipped on Steam. So you can actually go on Steam and filter by detected technologies. The Entities package is one of the technologies that you can filter by. And so as you can see, there's, a little under 700 games, and this is kind of, all time on Steam has been released on there. Now, around 700 games is a pretty solid number, but to kind of put this in perspective a little bit, let's look at the year-to-date numbers. We're kind of in late November right now of 2025. And so year-to-date, there's been 219 games released on Steam that use the Entities package. That's like not quite one a day, but still pretty close to that. Now, we compare that to all Unity games released on Steam. That number is 7,800. So if we take our 219 and kind of divide that out, we're looking at less than 3% of games released have been made using the Entities package. And that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the game is like full ECS. Maybe they're using something like, say, the Agents Navigation package, which is available on the Unity Asset Store, again, part of their Black Friday sale. And you could kind of use like a hybrid approach with that, where you still have game objects, but there's ECS entities kind of doing the pathfinding calculations. So it is a very niche community within inside of Unity as a whole. But, just kind of beyond some of those statistical numbers, if I may just kind of provide some anecdotal, some further anecdotal evidence about the state of dots and ECS. Other than just the game that I shipped earlier this year, I've now done consulting and contract work on several projects that have used dots and ECS, and my clients have been very happy with the results. Certainly, the road getting to those results have been a little bit bumpy, but we've been able to push through. And, ultimately in the contracting and consulting world, the results are what matters. And, the clients that I've worked with have told me over and over and again that, these projects would simply have not been possible with the previous ways that they were doing things. And, since we, built them out using a dots and ECS based approach, we've been able to achieve, much better performance than they were ever even expecting. So ultimately, I am pretty grateful for what Unity has done with this initiative. There's not really any other engine that is kind of doing this to this extent. I know Unreal has their kind of mass entity set up, but I haven't really heard much from that lately. It seems like there kind of was this initial little release of it, and I don't know if it has really been kind of a big deal for them. Whereas Unity seems to be, really going kind of all in on this almost, and now making it a core part of their engine. So, we can kind of transition now into talking about what the future looks like. So, I already kind of mentioned it in my silly little video, but there was not a whole lot of information related to dots and ECS in the keynote. The two things that were brought up were basically, talking about connections between a regular game objects project using Netcode for entities. And again, this just kind of seems like they are really wanting to push that entities for all, and again, kind of bringing it back to those business realities of the time and money invested into dots and ECS so far, with let's say really conservatively a 5% adoption rate of dots and ECS. The numbers don't really work out too well. So this definitely seems like this is the direction that things are heading in, is being able to use Unity kind of as is with ECS under the hood. And again, I'll talk about my thoughts on this a little bit later on, but just kind of going into some of the things that were brought up during the roadmap talk. But one of the first things they showcased is their new release schedule. And, I can't just help but laugh, because this release schedule, looks exactly like that release schedule that they went away from when they had the whole basically yearly version numbering system that they, kind of made a big deal that they were getting away from. So it is really interesting to see that less than 2 years goes by and they're back to basically the same version schedule, but now they've just, completely messed up all the numbers because we're on, Unity version 6000 now, but that's beside the point. All right, so let's talk about some of the big things. So in Unity version 6.4, this is when the entities package is going to be treated as a core package. And it sounds like, major releases of the entities package are now going to be tied into the editor versions. One thing they specifically called out in the roadmap talk is this would allow them to have faster release cycles of the entities stuff, which I do think is, good to get more of that stuff. But I think as it is already, Unity has been pretty good about being fairly consistent about a release schedule for the entities package. So it will be interesting to see if and how that changes. I know Unity is going to have a lot more to say on this later on, but from what I kind of understand is this is going to be similar to how the render pipelines work right now, how like each major version of the Unity editor kind of has some major updates and potentially breaking changes. So it will be interesting to see if things end up getting a little bit fractured where it's like, some of the newer entities features are not available on older versions of the editor. And I should say that this is like a little bit of speculation on my part right now. So like, don't freak out too much. I'm still kind of waiting to see how this all plays out and just kind of like, hypothesizing some things right now. But I mean, it kind of makes sense that they would need to tie it closer into the Unity editor version release schedule if they want to bring this Entities for All initiative. And speaking of that, it sounds like this is going to really start to come to fruition in the Unity 6.6 version, which is happening in late 2026. So about a year from right now, give or take. And this is when they're going to start integrating things like what I talked about with Danny in a previous video about basically having entity IDs on all game objects. And then we're going to be able to directly modify and access game object transforms from the ECS side. So this is kind of when that ECS for all really starts to be a core part of the engine. There is that Unity 6.6 version, again, what they're targeting right now. Now, Unity seems to have a whole lot of emphasis on the Netcode for Entities package. Again, it was the only thing dots related mentioned at the main keynote. And a couple cool things mentioned in the roadmap is that in the 6.3 LTS, which is going to be coming out very soon, they're going to be having some new features like host migration. So if the host drops off, then it can migrate to another one of the clients, which I think is a really cool feature to have. Also, some additional troubleshooting tools. So specifically, there's going to be some new profiler integrations that can help you debug network traffic. I think that's totally awesome. And then, they also kind of mention on here that sounds like Netcode for Entities is just going to be available probably seemingly out of the box for all game objects projects in Unity version 6.7. I'm sorry about that, you guys. Anyways, that's not going to be available till like 2027, so still a little ways away. But to talk about some things that are a little bit closer. So one thing that is actually already out that I was not aware of, it went completely under the radar for me, which is a massive, massive thing. Burst determinism for floating point math calculations. If you weren't aware, there are some slight differences in how different CPU architectures calculate certain floating point math operations. And this can lead to, slight little discrepancies, but those discrepancies can be noticed if those kind of, diverge more and more over time. This is especially apparent with, physics simulations, networked multiplayer. And I know those two particular things were not necessarily considered as deterministic for quite a while. Mostly my understanding was because of burst determinism that was not available as a feature. But it's available now. You can actually go use it now. There is actually some documentation on it in the burst package documentation. It's a little bit hidden, but it's under burst compilation and making code for burst compilation. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see there's the different float modes here. And so you can set this to be in a float mode of deterministic. And this does mention a couple of the other things related to burst determinism, a couple of the gotchas. So it is really cool to see. One thing that it does mention is that performance may be slightly less because there are probably some extra checks and balances that need to happen to get this to function across, all the different CPU architectures. I should mention this only works on 64-bit architectures, but it really seems like the big thing is just that, if you have some operations that result in not a number, all, platforms are going to result in having a not a number, but the, specific bits in the float are not going to be identical. So you couldn't do like a bitwise compare between those two. But I mean, that's like a pretty specific edge case that you could work around fairly easily. It does mention that, just because you're using this float mode of deterministic inside of a burst context, outside of the burst context, that is not guaranteed. So if you are using, any other math libraries or anything like that, that could kind of introduce some non-determinism into that. So, if determinism is important, make sure you're doing everything, within that bursted context. And so, yeah, also in the roadmap talk that they did mention that, now that we have burst determinism, that they are going to be bringing this to the Netcode for entities and physics packages. They didn't give any specific timeframes on those things, but it did sound like that was something that's, available on the table for us now, which is awesome. So speaking of physics, one of the big things that Unity also announced is that swappable physics backends are coming, which is, I think, overall a good thing. However, it is a bit unfortunate timing with the whole, havoc physics things that happening. If you weren't aware, Unity, it sounds like that they're probably just coming to the end of some sort of a business agreement where, Unity had a havoc physics for Unity package that was, fully managed and supported by people through Unity channels. However, it sounds like that is now expiring, and I believe it's in the Unity 6.4 version and going forward that it's really just up to Microsoft to provide support for Unity havoc physics. So it's kind of out of Unity's control if that's something that will continue to be a feature. So it's kind of really up to Microsoft if they want to continue to support it, which is a little bit unfortunate. But we're talking about a niche within a niche within a niche. Like, I don't think a whole lot of people were necessarily using the havoc physics package for Unity. However, the people that were, I'm sure, really needed it because it did have some specific use cases. But, going back to, now having these swappable physics backends and, potentially deterministic physics solver, I think those are maybe not necessarily an adequate replacement, but, you win one, you lose one kind of thing. And one other really cool physics related thing is this new low-level 2D physics API, which is kind of based off of, I guess, a newer version of Vox 2D than what has been present in Unity since forever and a half. And this is something that actually was mentioned in the keynote, but I don't think they really kind of talked about this part, is that it just really is like a low-level physics API that's not tied into game objects. So if you want to create ECS compatible structs for it, you totally can. So this is amazing news, because I know that's one thing that I've seen in my comments for, since I've pretty much started doing ECS content is, if there's going to be any 2D specific physics tools for ECS. And while this is not, a specific ECS 2D thing out of the box, you can use this to create your own, 2D ECS physics, which I think is awesome. So really looking forward to playing around with that. And yeah, it sounds like, 2D stuff is getting a fair bit of love, because there also is this new 2D bone animations that I guess the inverse kinematics basically uses the job system and burst compiler. So, really cool to see that that's getting some, major efficiency gains. And again, that's not something that's necessarily tied to ECS. So it sounds like that could be kind of used from a regular game objects project. Will be interesting to see what an ECS integration for that is like. Is it kind of what we have to do with 3D animations right now, if we're not using some third-party animation package where we kind of have to do some, game object to entity linking sort of thing. But, again, cool to see that jobs and burst are kind of bringing their performance improvements to various parts of the engine here. And then that brings us to talking about 3D games. And this is where the kind of big concerning things come in here. And you may have recalled that in the past few Unite and GDC talks, Unity has been really wanting to show off these awesome new world building and animation tools that have been something that have kind of been in the engine. Maybe the terrain stuff is not that great, but the animation stuff is a little more workable. But I think we could all agree that having some improved versions of these would be awesome. And the really unfortunate thing is, in this roadmap talk, in fact, I missed it the first time around because I was just kind of scrubbing through to see if there was any really big important things, but they paused development on both of these things. Now, I think the world building team unfortunately got shut down a few months ago. So I think that one had kind of already been known that world building was something that likely wasn't going to be happening anymore. But yeah, man, the animation tools is such a big blow, especially because to all the ECS people who have been using this for, a decade now without a proper animation tool set that we could use, really just stings, especially because it seemed like this was a quite mature product. They had a lot of really cool demos to show of it. I know people who have used it internally at Unity, and it sounded really cool. Their kind of reasoning for this, if you could say, is that they are kind of focusing their efforts to bring Unity kind of up to the speed with the core CLR, which again, I think is a good thing. It, will modernize the C# API, bring performance improvements. I think that stuff is all good. The reasoning, though, for halting world building and animation tools to prioritize that is a little bit weird to me, just because are the people who are working on world building and animation tools the people who are doing this low-level core CLR conversion? Maybe, but it doesn't really pass the smell test for me. I mean, I suppose you could make the argument that these world building and animation tools would be better once the core CLR conversion has been complete, but I mean, I feel like you could say that about a lot of other features in the Unity engine. Again, I don't really know the ins and out technical issues of all this stuff, and I'm sure there have been a lot of conversations over at Unity about this specifically, but that one sucks big time. Now, I'm sure the development team over at Rukanka is probably pretty happy about this announcement, to be honest, because Rukanka is an asset over on the asset store that is specifically made for creating 3D animations for DOTS and ECS projects. And honestly, it's a great package. I've used it in a few projects myself. They recently released a kind of major version 2 of this. If you already had the version 1 of this, then you can kind of get a fairly significant discount on this. And this one is able to do CPU and GPU based animations, and it supports pretty much all the same animation features that regular Unity animation does. They've done a really good job at it, and I've barely even scratched the surface of this. And I think it's a really great asset. And if Unity is not going to provide a animation tool set, then go get the Rukanka one. And by the way, it is available for 50% off right now on the Unity Asset Store as part of their Black Friday sale, which is happening right now. There's a ton of things available on sale, including my asset called Dot Survivors, which is, I think, a really fantastic learning resource for showing you how to create a full game with dots, integrating it with a bunch of the existing Unity features, and kind of highlighting some of those pain points that are still there when creating a full game with dots in ECS. Another big ECS based one is the Agents Navigation package. I've done a few videos on my channel, specifically about this one, but if you want to do any type of pathfinding with ECS agents, or they even have a crowds expansion to this, which is good for kind of flow field pathfinding for large groups of units. And if you've already clicked around on the asset store for this Black Friday sale, make sure you keep going back, because each week they're adding more and more items to this sale. In fact, the second week of this sale kicks off today. There's a really cool one that I have my eye on, which is this rapid icon in editor icon generator, where if you have like a bunch of 3D assets, you can create icons for these. So maybe if you have like a shop or a skill tree and you want some icons tied to specific objects in your game, this allows you to quickly do that. If you want to, kind of rotate things around, get different angles, put different styles on things, have all your icons with a similar look, you can do that quickly and easily right within the editor, which I think is awesome. They also have flash deals happening every day. So I got a good one for all the Dots fans who are not skipping through this ad right now, which is A-Line, which is one of my absolute favorite assets for ECS because it allows you to create basically debug lines and gizmos. You can call this stuff from all the, just straight from ECS in a fully bursted context. This is something that I pretty much import into all of my ECS projects right away, just because it is so useful and you can draw a lot of things on screen, which is good, helpful information to have. So thanks to the Unity Asset Store for sponsoring this video. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of wrap up here with my thoughts on, where ECS is at right now and what I think about the future. So, I'll reiterate again, I think ECS is great. Obviously, I made a whole YouTube channel around it and have been able to create a business around it as well. I'm really happy with what the team has done so far with it. But again, there certainly are some pain points, and it seems like they are improving some of those, but it does seem like a lot of their effort is going to be going towards this Entities for All initiative. And again, from the business perspective of Unity, I understand why they're doing that, because they've likely spent tens of millions of dollars at this point, and it's like, why would you continue to make things that are only for less than 3% of the people who are using your product? The math doesn't necessarily check out on there. Now, I should clarify, I'm not mad that Entities for All is happening. I think it's a good thing overall that regular people who use Unity will get a lot of the benefits of Dots and ECS, likely without even knowing it. And it still kind of gives you the availability to go a little bit deeper and kind of integrate game objects and ECS. We'll be really interested to see how that all plays out. I think there was like a quick mention in the roadmap talk somewhere about, at some point they're going to give us the ability to add ECS components to game objects. So it'll be interesting to see if that's kind of how this Entities for All will end up playing out. But I am really curious about how many people are actually going to, intentionally use these Entities for All features. Are people even going to know, A, that that's an option, B, are they going to be able to recognize when there is a specific case in their project that may benefit them by creating an ECS system to improve performance in the project? Is that going to be obvious somehow? It could kind of come through education, me sharing some things on the YouTube channel and all that. And of course, Unity kind of doing their own work in that regard. And, are people willing to, potentially go through some pain of learning ECS and frustration with some of the weird quirks and everything of that all? It will be really interesting to see. But the other side of it is I understand the frustration as someone who uses ECS on a daily basis, that there are a lot of features that are still lacking. The editor can be quite frustrating to deal with sometimes. Some things are slow and very buggy, and the debugging workflow and some of these editor windows, they're great. They show good information, but they're not necessarily straightforward to how you get to that. You kind of have to go through a bunch of steps, and it can get old kind of using those after a little while. So that is something that I would much like to see some improvements on. And just kind of simple things I don't really like the prefab workflow too much. Even though I use it quite a bit, I have kind of some issues about using it at scale. But yeah, I am extremely bummed out about the world building and animation tools, because those sounded really promising endeavors, and they were fully compatible with ECS projects, but they're also compatible with regular game object projects. So it's everyone benefits from these things, even though it is a fully ECS compatible animation solution, everyone still gets these new awesome features and everything. So again, that just is a real bummer to see. Now, will I continue to use ECS? Absolutely. I very much prefer the data-oriented workflow. You know, I've been using it for a while now, so I am quite familiar with it. But in, you know, some of my personal projects as well as client projects, I've had to do some major refactors in these projects, like, you know, big like overhauls of large sections of these projects. And, you know, yeah, it takes a while, and sure, there are some annoyances, and you know, not everything goes smoothly in these big endeavors, but ultimately I feel like it went relatively well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that data is separated from the logic, and I am able to just kind of go in there, rip certain things out, put new things in, disable systems that I don't need, enable systems. It gives me a lot of flexibility to do that. And I really like that a lot. And I mean, yeah, as long as my clients continue to be happy with the results of ECS, I'll continue making ECS projects for them, you know, both in the games industry and outside of the games industry, because I do think there are a lot of applications outside the games industry that are not really being talked about as much. Also, am willing to confirm right now for the people who are watching this deep into the video that I am working on a game right now that I'm going to be selling on Steam next year. But we'll be having more to say about that within the next few months here. But as you could guess, that game is a fully DOTS and ECS based project. Been happy with the initial phases of development here. And yeah, really looking forward to continuing developing this for the next little bit here. And so yeah, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and close out this video here. And you know what, I will just leave one final thing for the hardcore Turbo Makes Games fans who are this deep into this video, where this video is a lot longer than I expected it was going to be already. But today, the day this video goes live, is my birthday, and I do want to call it out because it is a special one, because I turn 20 years old in hexadecimal. Yes, it is a special programmer milestone because now you need 5 bits to represent my age, which is a you know, a cool thing. So yeah, with that, thank you so much for being part of the Turbo Makes Games community, the DOTS and ECS community. And I do really want to hear all of y'all's thoughts on this stuff. You know, what things do you like? What things are you still concerned about? You know, feel free to leave that all down in the comment section below, or join us over on Discord. And once again, go check out the Asset Store Black Friday sale. Thank you to the Asset Store for sponsoring this video. And there are a lot of cool things on there. Anyways, I'll stop rambling, but I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.